Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and Bill Barlee's with me. He's an author, a historian, a gold miner, ex-school teacher, for heaven's sakes. And today we're going into a part of the country, at the upper end of the Similkameen Valley. Really a fascinating story out of this area.
Yeah, Princeton, an area, Mike. It was called Vermillion Forks, and I kind of liked the old name. It had kind of reminiscent of the Old West. But they changed the name from Vermillion Forks to Princeton in 1860, so it's been changed for over 130 years. And they changed it because the Prince of Wales visited Canada. But, you know, it's steeped in history, and I call it a four-cornered town, Mike. And I'll tell you why I call it a four-cornered town, because from the four cardinal directions of the compass, you have different attractions. In the west of Princeton, in the early days, you had Granite City, which was once the fourth largest town in British Columbia, which is very surprising, 1885, more than a century ago. Platinum and gold in that area, very, very fascinating. In the north, you have that Highland Valley in the Nicola country, and that's the gold and silver properties there. Mm-hmm. In the east, you had Hedley, which at one time was the greatest gold mine in Canada. And then in the south, you had even, I think, a greater mine, and that's the old Copper Mountain mine and gold on the placer gold, specifically on the Similkameen River.
With all of those attractions, pretty well guarantee a lot of attention to a place that was at the confluence of a couple of rivers, and you always feel that when two rivers join an area like this, it's going to set itself up as a permanent town.
Yeah, and the old trails and the old routes tend to go through those areas. For instance, the Brigade Trail came through this country, and then it was followed in the 1860s by the famous Dewdney Trail, which went east and west. And then, of course, the railroad came in. And now it's the Hope-Princeton Highway. So Princeton's been there a long time. We'll be there a long time in the future.
Okay, we'll take a look at Princeton today as we talk about actually the surrounding area and get some great shots of Princeton 100 years ago right after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking about, well, first of all, Vermillion Forks, later to be known as Princeton. But when does the action really start around here?
Well, as early as 1853, as you're talking about mining.
Predates the Caribou Rush.
Yeah, it does indeed. A guy called McClellan picked up gold on the South River, which was called the Roche, or the Similkameen, we know it now. And followed by, and you know, the South River is interesting. I had a placer play on that river about 10 years ago, Mike. And they picked up coarse gold then. You can still pick up coarse gold in places, in selected places. And I was thinking back this morning of an old guy called K.C. Davis I used to prospect with. Very taciturn man, very nice guy, but very, very quiet. He was a very reserved sort of individual. I used to go out prospecting with him, 2 or 3 times a year. And I remember we went into my claim on the Similkameen just below Friday Creek some years ago. And we were getting nuggets that particular day. We came down, quite a bit of excitement in camp. We were getting nuggets, ounce and a half ounce, a lot of very, very coarse gold, way up the river, way beyond Whipsaw and Blackfoot and all those storied old camps of the 1880s and 1890s. And I thought he would never be affected. And I took my share, which was 25%, because I had guys working for me on a split basis. And we went back to Princeton to have supper. And when we went into the hotel in Princeton, I sat down and I had supper, and I noticed that K.C. Davis was getting quite garrulous. He really was getting quite garrulous, most out of character. And he was tipping the waitress and talking loudly, and I looked at him and I said, you know something? You know what was wrong, Mike?
I bet you it's gold fever.
You bet. That's what he had.
Gold fever.
It was a classic case of gold fever.
Well, I mean, until you get the nuggets in your hand, you don't really know what this thing will do to you.
No, not for sure.
And so K.C. Davis, did he recover from this? Did he return his taciturn self? Did he sort of blush and say?
After about 6 or 7 hours, he came back to normal. He came down to earth. But you know, it's a fascinating area. And the first guy I think that's really the father of the Similkameen is John Fall Allison. And he came in there in 1858 with a letter from Douglas to do some prospecting. He found some gold, a little bit of gold, not a lot, and found some coal as well. And he stayed to settle as a cattleman. Became a very, very well-known cattleman. And was, I think, the most well-known name in the entire Similkameen
Well, Allison
Valley.
Pass is now
sure.
named after him. And
Yeah.
why do you know anything about the man's character, of why he would say no to the gold rush, which even affected old taciturn fellows whose character was well established?
Sure.
Why would he say, "I'm going to not do that. I'm going to go cattleman"?
Well, I don't think he was a natural prospector. It takes a certain bent of mind, you know. And the bunch grass in that country was, you know, as high as a horse's belly, and marvelous cattle country in the 1850s and 1860s. And of course, he settled down with the two branches of the Allison family. There's the Indian branch of the Allison family. His first wife was an Indian woman, a Similkameen woman, and they took the Allison name, of course. And I know some of them quite well, in fact, in various parts of the Similkameen. Fine Indian families. And then there was the White Allisons, and that was his second family. And they were spread throughout the Similkameen as well. So the Similkameen River really in the 1860s was well worked, but there was another river well worked too, Mike, and that was on the northwest side, actually the west side of Princeton itself, and that's the old Tulameen River. Mm-hmm. And it was discovered in 1885. We alluded to this years ago by a guy called Johnny Chance. They say he was the first discoverer. I don't think he was, because the Chinese, there's definite proof that they were working that river, Mike, between 1860 and 1885, a quarter of a century, and keeping it to themselves. They were working creeks like Bear Creek and Eagle Creek and Boulder Creek, all different names now. And they were getting nuggets out 30 ounces, 40 ounces, 50-ounce slugs out of that area. And that's the platinum side, too, Mike, which is kind of interesting.
And platinum wasn't particularly enamored by anybody until the turn of the century, I guess, but the Chinese saw, or sensed its potential.
Oh, sure they did. Sure, they were putting platinum away, and eventually came back and retrieved some of it. But you know, the big town then was not Princeton, really. In 1885, it was Granite Creek, and Granite Creek had a lot of very fascinating characters. One of them was a guy called Red Paddy, whose name was really David Whitley, but everybody knew him as Red Paddy. And, you know, mining and exaggeration tend to go hand in hand in certain areas.
Mining and exaggeration, okay.
And I think certainly Red Paddy was indicative of this, because he said he went through Granite Creek, and, you know, when it was in his heyday, and the roving preachers would come in, you know, and he would hold the hat out, and all the miners would throw nuggets in the hat, and they would pay the preacher. Well, that may or may not be the case. Of course, there were a number of preachers that came through the area. I think the most well-known was the miner's priest, who was really an Anglican minister, and this is Father Pat, Henry Irvin. And he was noted throughout all the mining camps.
Now, what role did he fulfill? Because I don't think of miners as being sort of very religious people. I mean, they were there for the gold, but what did Father Pat do?
He hearkened them back to their beginnings, you know, and
brought them back to civilized
That's right.
thought.
He brought them back to home and hearth, mother and family, and so on. A very, very interesting man. Read quite a bit about him. Quite impressed with him.
So he ministered to these guys,
oh,
and he
sure he did.
And he didn't sort of scrape off some of the gold for himself. He was a religious man.
That's right, he was. And, you know, you had a lot of fascinating characters besides Father Pat and Red Paddy. You had Bobby Stevenson. He was in that Similkameen country for years. And I've alluded to Bobby Stevenson before. And interesting man, high flyer, great exaggerator. Whenever he did something, he always did it first and did it best. And there was a story of a duel in that country, Mike, between Bobby Stevenson and an Indian chief called Ashinola John, Chushkin Ashinola John. And Ashinola John was a very tough character. In his cabin, in front of his cabin on Ashinola, in the Ashinola country, he had 12 or 13 scalps, and 3 or 4 of them were blonde. So they were white scalps, and he was not above taking a scalp from a white man or an Indian. And but Stevenson, according to his story, he got the best of Ashinola John. You know, he had a big difference of opinion with Ashinola John, and he walked up to him and he gave Ashinola John a pistol, and he said, Ashinola John, he said, I'm going to count to 10, and we'll walk off 10 paces. When I count 10, we both whirl and fire. And of course, according to Stevenson, he walked off his 10 paces, and he counted to 10, and he twirled and fired, and of course there was no Ashinola John in sight. Mm. I think the reverse probably was true.
So when did he tell this story? Before or after Ashinola John died? What was the...
Far after Ashinola John died. So no one was there to correct him, really.
Okay. There's a guy named Lothario in this
Yeah.
area, too. Were
Yeah.
these their real names, or were these names that they were sort of handed?
No, Simon Lothario really was an individual who existed existed, he existed on the South River, which was the Similkameen River. And he had a favorite saying, which I think is kind of worth repeating, and I've repeated it before, but it's worth repeating. He said, I have the best bank in the world, the bank of gravel, and I draw from it whenever I'm broke. So he had the best bank, didn't have to go and see the banker himself.
Yeah.
He had the gravel bank, he'd work in there and take the gold out, and he was no longer broke. And,
Good stuff. And that was what people did. Again, the coin of exchange
Sure.
was the gold nugget, and everybody had the gold scales to weigh it out, and they didn't deal with paper money or coin unless they really had to.
Certainly not much, Mike, until about I would think the late 1880s. So you had that western section, that Tulameen section, and then to the north you had the Highland Valley, and you had that Nicola country, which was beckoning to miners from all over as well. Mostly copper properties, some gold properties, not much silver up there. But then when you went east, and we've talked about it before in another program, you had Headley, which at one time was the greatest gold mine in Canada. For some years, it produced more gold than any other gold mine in Canada. That was a nickel plate, and later on the Mascot. And Headley, of course, was the link between Penticton and Princeton. And there was a stagecoach running back and forth between the two. At the turn of the century, about 1903, I think, to about 1911, the Welby stage, he called it his Welby's Flyer. And it went along that old route up through the Green Mountain country, and then down into the Similkameen, and up along past Headley, and then up along the old North Side Road, Mike. A lot of Indian
road
pictographs.
that's worth taking.
Oh,
that
yeah.
road still exists, and it
Sure.
it takes you off the highway, and it shows you the Similkameen from a different vantage point.
Sure, it shows you the Similkameen as it looked about 100 years ago. Old Indian campsites, the pictographs are still there. Really quite a fascinating place. And when you had those three starting to come into being, Princeton's really started to take hold. And we have a couple of pictures, at least one here anyway, of Princeton, and this is around the turn of the century, Mike. This particular photograph, you're looking at Bridge Street, and you're looking kind of due south across the Tulameen, right into the old town of Princeton. You can see the old false front buildings, and most of them, of course, are composed of wood. And this is typical of a frontier town at the time.
Now, again, Princeton existed as a supply center. I mean,
Sure.
all of these places we've alluded to,
Yeah.
the Tulameen, the South River, Headley, all of these, and all
Yeah.
that Princeton had to do was be a supplier to these, or be the recreational place for
Yes.
these people to go to.
So you had in Princeton this time probably a couple hundred people. That's all, Mike. But in the hills surrounding, you would have hundreds and hundreds of miners and prospectors. Guys who had their own little show, own little placer mine, or own little lode mine, and other individuals who were prospecting for, in some cases, diamonds. They believed there were diamonds in the Similkameen for a while. They're placer prospecting for platinum and gold, or they're prospecting for copper, silver, and lode gold.
Now, this photograph here shows people at the foot of one of the streets in Princeton panning for gold. I guess if your stake ran out, you could zip down there and maybe a pennyweight or two?
Yes, you actually could. You could go down and pan your supper at the end of the main street, right on Bridge Street, right where the Tulameen comes through town, and still does today, and you could actually pick up gold and platinum down there, Mike. And of course, Princeton itself was quite fascinating because had the gold coming right through the town. And at one end of the town, which is now covered, unfortunately, was the old Vermillion Cave. And this was the refuge for guys on the run in the early years, not when Princeton became well established. Yeah. And then they stored stuff in there, and it was a place of shelter and so on.
It's right in behind the bus depot in Princeton now.
Yeah.
And as you say, there's a concrete wall in front of it, and you'd never know it was there.
And the interesting thing, Mike, if you look at that sandstone, those cliffs there, you can go right up top and you see some gravel. Now, I don't advise people to do this because you fall off there, you can kill yourself. But actually, there's gold in that gravel right up on top. So there was an old run coming over the top. And a guy called Pomp Heap, old friend of mine who just passed away.
Pomp Heap?
Yeah, he got the name Pompadour, it really was originally.
Oh, the hairstyle?
Yeah, that's right,
yeah?
Because he was a professional hockey player in one of the American leagues. And he came in and was administrator, I believe, at the hospital there. And in his spare time, he'd go down in the basement and pan for gold.
In the basement?
Sure.
Of what?
Of the old hospital in Princeton.
Sure. Not bad, if you had a little time between administration duties.
Take visitors in there, too.
A couple of pennyweight of gold.
Sure.
Pomp Heap.
Yep.
What a great story that is.
But I think so we've looked at the west, we've looked at the north, we've looked at the east. Now you look at the south. And you look at the south and you have that Similkameen River, and you had one of the greatest lode copper properties in the province.
You
Not much
suggest
doubt
it
about
was even better than Headley? Can you really make a justification for that?
Much more value came out of Copper Mountain. Now, Copper Mountain, when we touched on volcanic brown some years ago, he discovered that. Well, he didn't discover it, the Jamesons discovered, but he came in there and staked it in 1898, along with a guy called Emil Voigt. And volcanic brown sells out immediately for about $40,000 and blows the money high, wide, and handsome. But when he put down a shaft on that, he went straight down the most valuable part of the mountain. But it didn't really come into its own for a long time, Mike. So Copper Mountain kind of carried on, hits and misses, and they thought it was going to be a world beater, but it wasn't until about the 1920s, after the railroad came in. The railroad came in about 1911, you know. And so after the railroad came in, then Copper Mountain starts to come into its own. And by that time, of course, there were a number of other properties in Princeton. There were coal properties. Now, Allison had discovered coal on the Similkameen River and the Tulameen River in about 1858. And so by the turn of the century, a lot of the locals, Mike, were burning coal in their own stoves.
They're just chipping it out of the
Sure they were.
out of the ground for their own uses.
Taking it right out of the seam. And so they had a lot of interesting collieries in the area.
Well, Blakeburn comes
Yeah.
from not far away from here, doesn't it? And
Yeah, Blakeburn was probably, it was the greatest, but there were others too. There was the Red Triangle, there was the Blue Flame, there was the Pleasant Valley, there was Vermillion Forks mine. All these were collieries. Vermillion Forks, for instance, and they had trouble with them, as usual. Not just Blakeburn had trouble with fire, they had trouble with fire in the coal in Princeton. And as late as 1928, you could go into Princeton, and you could see the flames on the horizon, fairly close by, actually, from the Vermillion Forks mine, where the underground fires, which have been burning for years, broke through to the surface.
so fires would begin in these coal seams and they just stay smoldering
Oh,
for,
yeah.
for
Oh,
years?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for years, literally for years. And so you have a really quite a fascinating history. And
As soon as you get collieries in, too, you get big sort of industrial structures. You get more men
Sure you
to
do.
operate in there,
Sure
and
you
so that must have been one of the mechanisms for driving the growth of Princeton, too.
Oh yeah, there were hundreds and hundreds of workers, not just in Blakeburn, but in Princeton itself. And some of these collieries were quite big at the time.
You know, the thing about Princeton, when I go there to this day, just to the south of it, there are those level banks just to the south, and
Yep.
they look like, I don't know, tailings
Tailings,
piles
they are,
and stuff.
yeah.
And that makes up sort of the geography of Princeton today. Is that from Copper Mountain? Where's
Well,
that from?
That's from Allenby, yeah, essentially. And what Allenby, you see, is related to Copper Mountain, and that's where a lot of the ore was processed and so on. So that tailings pile, which is a mountain of tailings, came down from Copper Mountain originally, and came down on the old cliffside railroad at one time, which later became a kind of a cliffside road, went down into Allenby, and that's where the concentrator was. Allenby operated for years and years and years. In fact, Mike, it's very interesting. This mine essentially started in about 1898, and Copper Mountain is still active in the 1990s.
It's now called Similco. It's Cassiar Mining Company
Yeah.
owns it or something?
Yeah.
And so they're still processing gold and copper and all sorts of other things out of that area.
Getting a fair amount of gold out of that copper property as well. But you know, I have a lot of good memories about this area, Mike. I could think of one when I think about the area, and one of my favorite stories, I guess, is about an old lady who just passed away about 2.5 years ago. Her name was Mrs. Sutheran. And I was doing some work in that area in about 1968, I think it was, Mike. So that's, a few years ago. And I had heard from the locals that her husband, who had been long deceased by the time 1968 rolled around, had made a terrific strike on Eagle Creek, which is now called Britton Creek, in 1926. So I'm going there 40 years after the fact. And according to the locals, he'd made such a big strike that he had picked up enough platinum to make her a necklace that hung from her neck right down to her knees, and then he had bought himself a new car and so on and so forth, and he cleaned up 2,000 ounces of platinum. Well, I doubted this. So anyway, I went in there in 1968, knocked on her cabin door, Mike, and her cabin was about 30 feet by 20 feet, and I introduced myself, and she was a very, very courteous woman. She invited me in, she knew of me, and as I stepped in the room, Mike, I saw a great big old Western bar down one side of this dining sitting room there, about 25 feet long. It was a beauty. Black mahogany or black oak, I'm not sure which, beveled mirror behind. Only thing missing was the brass rail. So I stopped, and at that time, 68, that was worth about $500. That's all a Western bar was worth. So I stopped to admire this bar. I said, gosh, Mrs. Sutherland. I said, that's a great bar. Well, she said, Mr. Barlee, I don't know why Granite ever brought that home from Granite Creek. She said, I've been dusting around it, I've been walking around it, I don't know what to do with it. She said, you know, and I'm tired of it. And she said, you know that brass thing? And I said, yeah, the brass rail, because it was missing. She said, well, I've got it outside. And I looked out in the garden out through the window, and she'd broken it in half and was using it for a hoe. So anyway, I wasn't there to see about that. And I said, look, can I take a look at at your husband's diary? Have you still got that? She said, yes, I have. So she went into a little bedroom and came out with a diary, and I perused the diary, and they said he'd got 2,000 ounces. He'd got 200 ounces, Mike.
Yeah, a little exaggeration is good for any story, I guess.
Multiplied by 10. And then as an afterthought, I said, Mrs. Southerland, do you still have the necklace your husband gave you? She said, yes, I have, Mr. Barlee said very proudly. Went back into the bedroom, came out with a box like this, and I thought, gosh, this is going to be a great necklace, and opened the lid and took out some tissue paper, and then took that all out of there, and then there's some chamois in there, and she took out a tiny little necklace like this, and there was a piece of gold and a piece of platinum and a piece of electrum, which is a mixture of gold and silver, and that's all she had.
Not quite as spectacular as the story.
Not quite as spectacular. And so anyway, I'd spent a comfortable 2 hours with her, very entertaining, and she escorted me to the door. And as I went to the door, I turned back and looked at this bar, and I said, gosh, that's a marvelous bar. And I happen to have $700 in my back pocket at the same time.
Just
the bar was,
happened, yeah.
That's right. And the bar was only worth $500. And I said, so I said, yeah, it's really a nice bar. She said, Mr. Barlee, I just don't know what to do with it. I'd like to get rid of that. Well, I said, gosh, and I thought, oh, well, I'll give the old girl more than it's worth, because it comes from Granite City. I said, Mrs. Southerland, I said, I'll give you $700. She looked at me and said, well, Mr. Barlee, if it's worth that, I'll just keep it.
Oh, goodness.
If I'd offered her $50, she would have said, take her away.
Okay, take a break here. Be back in a second with more Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Got a little gold in my pan here. It's not a legitimate gold pan. Some of it's got a little quartz in it. This comes from the Tulameen River.
Yeah, about $1,200, $1,300 worth there, I think, Mike, and that's from the Tulameen, and the quartz means that hasn't traveled too far. When you get a number of pieces with quartz seeded into it, you know that the string of the quartz stringer is fairly close by, probably within a mile or two.
If I were to just be your recreational gold panner and head down to the Tulameen, would I get into trouble?
You might on certain claims if they're actively working it. They don't appreciate people who are trespassers. If you carry a free miner certificate, you're allowed access, that's all.
Just access. You can't...
You can go through.
You can go through, but you can't pan?
Can't stop and pan.
Sounds like interesting country, though.
Yeah.
Still with gold, still with platinum in that area, and maybe even still a big black oak walnut bar from Granite City in somebody's house down there. Some of the stories of the Princeton area today, a source, sort of a supply center for Headley, for Allenby, for Copper Mountain, for Granite Creek, for the places up in the Nicola toward Merritt. Our Gold Trail and Ghost Town travel for today. Thanks for being with us. Back again next time. We'll see you then.